Hello, this is Mr. Dryer coming at you from Menchville High School with another AP government lesson. Today we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention and a number of compromises that are in the Constitution. So, a little bit of backstory. Remember in one of the previous lessons we talked about the Articles of Confederation, which was a foundational document you need to know, and it is the first government of the United States. And it was a government for about 10 years. Now, remember, it did not work well. It had a lot of flaws. We don't need to go over all of them now, but basically they had no power of enforcement. They had no power to really raise taxes and money from the states. They had no strong standing military and no money to pay the military. They could not regulate interstate commerce. And the list goes on. So basically, after Shays' Rebellion, a bunch of states said, let's get together and try to amend the Articles of Confederation or talk about how we could change the Articles to make them better. And so this convention was called in Philadelphia from May to whenever. And as it turns out, it lasted several months in 1787. Now, remember, all of these delegates that were sent to this convention were from the 13 different states. And some of them thought they were going there just to amend the articles. But others said, you know what, this is a great opportunity to actually completely replace the articles because they're so messed up, it's really not worth trying to fix them. And keep in mind, 13 of the 13 states would have to agree to amend them. Remember that was one of the flaws with the articles in the first place. So Madison shows up and he says, look, I have this plan for a new type of government, and from there it's all history. Now, to be fair, Madison didn't have the entire Constitution written out as we know it today. That's what some people often think or say. But he had a good outline, and throughout those few months, people debated it, and they wrote some compromises into it, and they changed it, and it is what we know today as the Constitution. So, let's see what compromises are in it. First of all, let's look at the AP curriculum standards. This is important to keep us really on base with what we need to know for the AP test. This says explain the ongoing impact of political negotiation and compromise at the Constitutional Convention. So not only do they want you to explain these compromises here, we have the Great Compromise, the Electoral College, Three-Fifths Compromise, and the compromise on the importation of slaves. They want you to be able to explain those and recognize them. They also want you to be able to explain how those might still be issues today. Now, some of these are not. Obviously, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, so that's not going to be a thing. But you can definitely say how the Great Compromise still impacts the country today, or say the Electoral College. And we're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about each one of these. In my class, I would have a few questions on a quiz or maybe identification where you explain this. And just want to make sure we're on the same page in my class. It's really not enough just to watch these videos. These are supposed to be a quick review. Just kind of touch base with you, make you know what you need to know. You still need to do all the other work, like read the chapter in the book, listen to the lecture in class, look at the PowerPoint, do the assignments, etc. But this would be a good start. So let's look at the Great Compromise first. Here's the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. There were two major plans for the government. We got this Virginia plan and we have the New Jersey plan. And these plans really had different structures for the government, but the basic difference was representation. Representation. All right, so the Virginia plan called for 3 different branches, like we have today. And it would call for a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. The legislative branch would be bicameral. That's a term you may not be familiar with, but it means 2 different legislative bodies. So the upper house today is called the Senate, and the lower house is called the House of Representatives. And the big question was, how do you choose people to fill these houses. And in this plan, they would be chosen based on state population. So if you had a state that had a high population, a large population, you would get more representatives and more senators. So this would be very helpful for Virginia because Virginia actually had one of the largest populations. It may have actually had the largest population. I'd have to go check that. So it would benefit from this system because it would get more senators and more representatives. And if you have more people in these houses, you have a better chance of getting your policies passed. And so some states that were smaller states had problems. Now, I want to be very clear. When I say large state, what I really mean is large in population. It doesn't matter about the land area. If I say small state, I mean it has a small population. So that's really what we're talking about here. Let's go to this other plan, the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan called for a unicameral legislature. So only one house. I don't know what they wanted to call it. Let's just say it was the House of Representatives. And the people in the House of Representatives would be chosen based on equal representation. So every state would get this exactly the same amount of people in this house. So this is very much like the Articles of Confederation, where every state got one vote, regardless of population. So let's just say today California has like 53 million people. That might be close. And let's just say they get 10 representatives. And Alaska has like 1 point whatever million. They would also get 10 representatives. Now, as you can imagine, most people didn't think that was a very good idea. It seemed great to the small states like New Jersey, but a lot of other states have problems with it. So now we have this issue. We have small states versus large states, and they had to come up with a compromise. So they basically took these two plans and they squished them together. They basically made a centaur. They had a horse and they had a man. They put them together and they got a centaur. So what they did was they said, okay, we will have 3 branches of government. And sure, let's just call one the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. It's very peaceful drawing these little pictures. You really get in touch with your inner Bob Ross. Okay, and we will have 2 houses in the legislative branch. Sure, let's call the upper one the Senate and the lower one the House of Representatives. Now here's where we really squish the plans together. In the Senate, every state gets equal representation, meaning every state gets 2 senators, regardless of size, and that has been the same up until today. In the lower house, it is based on population. So basically, if you are a larger state, you get more representatives. If you are a smaller state, you get fewer. So for instance, the least amount you could have is 1. Today, Alaska gets 1 representative, and Virginia gets 11, and California gets, I think, like 53. Might be off a little bit on that, but that's because of population. And we're going to go into this a lot more later because it's changed a little bit over time. So that's the major idea. The major idea is equal representation versus representation based on population or apportioned by population. If you know that, you're going to be completely fine. Okay, moving on. The key word there is bicameral. The unicameral legislature has 1 house. A bicameral legislature has 2 houses, like a biplane or a bicycle with 2 wheels. And unicameral, like a unicorn. See, this unicorn only has 1 horn. Wow. My poor unicorn. Okay, so moving on. The next thing we need to talk about is the 3/5 compromise. I didn't put anything here because I wanted to draw a little bit. We'll see if that works out. But the 3/5 compromise is the next basic question. So we just said that the lower house, the House of Representatives, is based on population. That seems pretty easy. Let's just go count everybody in a state, And depending on how many people you'll get more representatives. And in the Constitution, it was based on for every 30,000 people in your state, you would get one representative. All right, so let's just go count. If you have 30,000, you get one. If you have 50,000, you get one. If you have 62,000, you get two. You get the idea. So it's by increments of 30. And you can't have less than one. So if you have 25,000, you still have one. That seems easy. What's the problem? Well, some states wanted to count everyone, and some states wanted to count non-slaves. So the states that wanted to count everyone were, of course, states with a very large slave population. They wanted to count every single person, including every single slave, because then they would get more representatives. The northern states did not want to count the slaves at all. And you kind of see the logic there, because they said, hey, if these southern states that have slaves count all their slaves as people, and of course they're people, but as people who count for representation, then they're going to get more representatives. And those representatives are more likely to vote to keep slavery. And that's a bad thing. It gives the southern states more power. It really gives the southern states more representation based on people that they don't even allow to vote. So the northern states and the southern states disagreed on how to actually count or allocate the representatives based on population. To illustrate my idea here, though, I found this. I'm sorry if this is a little blurry. This says representation for Virginia in 1790. So how many white people were in the state? 442,000. And how many enslaved people were? 292,000. All right, so based on a 3/5 compromise, you would count all of this population right here, and then you would take this number right here and take 3/5 of it. So multiply it by 3/5. You get 175,000. So you add that number to your first number, and that's the number you come up with, 617,000. Okay, so if you counted only the free population, Virginia would have only gotten 15 representatives. All right, if you counted the free and the enslaved populations, like you counted everybody, Virginia would get 25 representatives. So we got 15, 25. And under the compromise, Virginia would get 20 representatives. And after they argued back and forth for a really long time, they decided to count the slave population or the non-free population as 3/5. It's not a perfect system, and obviously it gives these southern states more voting potential, which is a problem later on when we get up and towards, like, before the Civil War and even directly after. But that's the way it went. The northern states were a little unhappy about it, but they decided that they had to do it for the southern states to actually ratify the Constitution. However, a couple other things got put in the Constitution that were compromises. Okay, let's go back to this. We also need to know the compromise on the importation of slaves. And I'm going to go down here first to that, then I'll go back to this other thing. So the compromise on the importation of slaves. This is directly from the Constitution. By the way, the Constitution never uses the word slave, mainly because they felt a little guilty about this, obviously, and they just used other terms as euphemisms for slaves. So this says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. That seems weird. What does this mean? Really what they're saying here is slaves. What they really mean is slaves. And the year here is 1808. 1808. Well, let's think about this. The Constitution is basically ratified in 1780, about 88, 87, 88. So this is 20 years later. 20 years from when this basically becomes the law of the land. In that time span, the government cannot make a law banning the import of slaves. Now, as it turns out, it doesn't mean they were going to make the law in 1808. It just means that they couldn't make it before 1808. But as it happened, after 1808, the government actually did pass a law banning the slave trade. And you're probably thinking, well, Mr. Dreyer, if it banned the slave trade in 1808, why was there a civil war in 1861? Because it just banned the importation of slaves from other countries. It doesn't matter if it was Central America, South America, where there are a lot of enslaved people, or Africa. It said, well, you can't bring them in to this country anymore. But it did not actually get rid of the slave trade or slavery in the country. So the slave trade still existed inside of the country up until the Civil War. And that means that by natural increase and also by people selling slaves to different states in the South, slavery increased and spread. So it didn't solve the problem, unfortunately. But this entire thing was a compromise also, because the northern states wanted to, or the southern states wanted to make sure that the slave trade wasn't banned right away. That was a big worry for them, that the Constitution would be ratified and the slave trade would be banned. And so they had this put in there. The other thing they got put in there was kind of a fugitive slave law. Now, over time, there were many more of these passed. And really what this says is if a slave escapes from the southern states up to the north, then they can be captured and sent back south. And this says no person held to service or labor in one state. Notice they don't use the word slave, but that's what they meant. Under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up. So really what it's saying is, if you're a slave in the South and you escape to the North, you're still a slave and you can still be caught and you can still be sent back to the South. So it does feel like the southern states definitely got a lot in the Constitution. You know, they got the Three-Fifths Compromise, they got this fugitive slave clause in here, and they also managed to make it so that the slave trade wasn't banned for 20 years. And unfortunately, the northern states agreed with this because they were getting a much stronger commerce clause and some other clauses in there that would help their commerce. I know it sounds very callous, but that's the reasoning. And so then, after they wrote this Constitution, they had to run around all the states to try to get it ratified. Okay, the last thing we need to talk about in here is the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the system of electing the president in the United States, which back in the day really had nothing to do with the direct vote of people at all. Really, you had some different options. Some people said, well, let the people vote at the state level. Some people said, well, let Congress select a president. And then the compromise was, let the states choose these people called electors based on population and let them vote. So really what that means is the states would get a number of electors based on population and senators. And I'm going to go over this in an entirely different video because it's going to take a little bit longer. But the president really was not directly elected by the people for many years up until about Andrew Jackson. Once you get to Jackson, a lot of states started allowing people to vote. Jackson. And then they would use that number of the people voting in the state to choose electors that they then had vote for the president. But this is a very, very complicated system. I think once you go over it a few times, it's really not that complicated, but people just get confused by it. So I'm going to show you some diagrams and graphs and go over it. The Electoral College, though, in the end, is a system of electing the president without a direct vote. Basically, a lot of these people, like Madison, did not trust the average person to vote. They said, well, your average person isn't educated enough, and also they don't get news fast enough to really know what to vote for. So it's a very elitist idea of government. And this is a great example of the elitist idea of government, where really only a small group of people that know what they're talking about or know what they're doing should be allowed to run the government. Okay? And actually, I'm going to go over that in a different video also, because there's 3 different types of government you have to know about, which is participatory, elitist, and pluralist. So I'll go back over it in a separate video and hopefully you'll understand it. All right, well, Hopefully you understood these different compromises that were in the Constitution and why they were there. And if you have any questions, let me know.